and I'll divide the talk into two parts. The first part are some sort of fairly catchy recent examples of data mining. Now, I'll try and bring it back to the framework presented by the two previous speakers with regard to regulation in the second half of the talk. Especially, I'll mention the EU's efforts to regulate data mining in the commercial market. So this is the first slide, and this, some of you may be familiar with this. This is a rather fascinating piece of recent research about the power of Facebook likes. Just to show you here. I'm not sure if you can read this, but basically, some academics at Cambridge University and Microsoft Research, they had a large corpus of 10 million likes from several thousand volunteers, and they also collected psychological and demographic data from those same individuals, and then they compared what they knew about the individuals with what they could predict statistically from just looking at their likes. And it's quite remarkable what you can predict. 95% probability of guessing the race correctly, that may not be a surprise. 93% guessing the gender. 88% guessing sexual orientation, maybe a bit more controversial than gender. 85% probability of getting your politics right. 82% of getting your religion, Christian or Muslim. And in some countries that could be rather controversial. Amazingly, even IQ, rather accurate predictions of IQ, age, whether you smoke, whether you're single or in a relationship, and of course, if you check the Facebook box about relationship status, they know anyway, but I mean, just guessing from your likes, they can get it. Whether you use drugs, whether your parents were divorced or still married at the age of 21, and the list goes on. So this is simply, and obviously Facebook there's no evidence that Facebook is actually doing this. This is purely academic research that shows the power of data mining. Next slide. And the reference is at the bottom of the slide if anybody wants to look up the paper. Now, this is actually not a new idea. There was a famous piece of research from more than a decade ago by a woman named Tanya Sweeney, who's now a professor, I believe, at Harvard. And she showed that in the United States, with 3 data points only, gender, age, and zip code, which is the American postal code, she could identify uniquely 87% of residents of the United States could be identified uniquely with just those 3 data points. And again, it's just an example of the unsuspected power of data mining to resolve facts that we generally think are not so easy to deduce. Okay, next slide. Now, this is also some recent remarkable research. It may be less surprising scientifically, but it turns out that in the United States, there's some databases that published, some individuals have allowed their entire genomes to be published for scientific purposes, under the assumption that it would be anonymous. But in fact, it turns out there's a fairly complicated way, but you can actually figure out who somebody is from their published DNA sequence of 3 billion base pairs. The way it works is that there's another database, a public genealogy database, where certain volunteers have provided snippets of their genetic information, these so-called short-handed repeats, never mind the technology. And you can read the paper to get the details, but basically by piecing this all together, they were able to identify a fair number of these volunteers uniquely from their anonymous published DNA sequence. Okay, so next slide. Now, put this together with this. Here we have, and this is recently in the New York Times, this woman here, this is her on the lower right. She's an artist, Heather Dewey Hagborg, okay? So what she does is she goes around New York City and she collects random bits of DNA, I mean, as in, chewing gum, cigarette butts, hairs, things like that, in kind of maybe unpleasant public places, like, in train stations, and sequences the DNA. She knows which zones in the DNA are responsible for your physical appearance. She applies some algorithm, and I wonder if it's manual or automatic, but anyway, she applies some algorithm in her computer, reconstructs what the face of this anonymous person should look like, and with pretty good results. This is her own reconstruction of her own face in the upper left-hand corner compared to her actual photograph. So she's going around New York City collecting bits of DNA and reconstructing the faces of the anonymous involuntary donors. Now imagine that you combine this with, say, Facebook's face recognition algorithm. Obviously you can't do this today, but imagine in 5 years' time you can pick up a piece of chewing gum, analyze the DNA, apply apply the Facebook face recognition algorithm, identify the person, perhaps uniquely, even if their DNA has never been recorded in any kind of law enforcement database. So again, this is purely academic, it's not actually happening, but it simply illustrates the technical possibilities which obviously are going to increase in the future and not stay stagnant. Next slide. So, and this is another piece of research. This is, again, let me warn you, this is purely academic research that Microsoft Research has done. I gave a version of this talk last week in Turkey, in Istanbul, and basically, well, I'll explain what happened. So Microsoft did some research. They got some volunteers in Seattle, 700 volunteers. They asked them to provide their GPS data for several months, and they built complex mathematical models which showed that actually we all have set habits, set routines, and there's a pretty good statistical chance of predicting where you will be 6 months from now at a specific time of day. Obviously, if you have an unexpected trip to Hawaii, the prediction will be wrong. But generally speaking, it has a remarkable accuracy, even far into the future. Now, let me add, this is purely academic research. It's absolutely not a Microsoft product. It's a technical demonstration of what can be done. Because I gave this talk in Turkey last week, and to my surprise and chagrin, the next day, there was an article in a Turkish newspaper presenting this as reality. So there had been a journalist in the room that didn't understand that it was purely academic research. So this is academic. It's not actually happening. Please. Next slide. Now, this, however, is happening. This is real. The wireless carriers all over the world are, without asking your permission, and this goes to Eric's example of the cell phone at the beginning, without asking your permission, they are already bundling, augmenting, enhancing, and then selling your data for commercial purposes. It's happening in the United States, it's happening in Europe. I'm not sure if it's happening in Asia, it may be. So let's look at some examples. Next slide, please. Let's skip this slide. Here's an example. This is a map of Buenos Aires, and what they've done is the blue spot, the big blue spot is the soccer stadium, and what they've done is they've tracked where did the people who went to the football match, where did they go after the game? What did they go to bars, to restaurants? Did they take the bus home? And this is just a one snapshot. Now, I have another slide which unfortunately is not in this deck, which is much more illustrative. It was in the Wall Street Journal just 10 days, last week actually. So Verizon Wireless, which I believe is the largest wireless carrier in the United States, has set up a subsidiary to do this. And they're working, for example, with the basketball team, the Phoenix Suns. And what they do is they can look at the cell phones of all the people in the basketball arena during a game, and they can give the demographic profile of those people because Verizon knows who you are. It can look up your name in a third-party marketing database, figure out what is your income, where you live, what is your age, your gender, your lifestyle, all of that. And then they tell the Phoenix Sun basketball team, not individually, but they can tell you the average age, the average income of the people in this audience at this basketball game. They can tell, and for example, the fast food restaurant across the street can have a marketing agreement with the basketball team to send a coupon by email to somebody saying, hey, I saw you at the game last Saturday, you can come to the next game, stop by our restaurant, and you'll get a discount. Now, all of this is being done without the knowledge or the permission of the data subjects. And so I think that's the key. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, you think that this kind of geo-tracking from cell phones, obviously the phone company knows who you are, but supposedly the basketball team, the customer of this data, does not know who you are. That's the defense of it. But in practice, actually, it's not obvious that this data is going to remain anonymous, because there's another piece of academic research recently published, February this year, in Nature. And they also got some volunteers, 15 months of mobile phone location from 1.5 million users. And they found that in 95% of the cases, you can take 4 individual points in space and time of somebody's cell phone, and you can, with a 95% probability, uniquely identify that individual just from knowing that they were at these 4 points in space and time. That's enough to separate you from everybody else in most cases. So, next slide. And there's a prominent researcher, internet privacy researcher, Arvind Narayanan, now at Princeton, and he's had this sort of famous statement a year or two ago. There really is no such thing as anonymous online tracking. Of course, reputable companies may make honorable commitments, which they may respect, not to de-anonymize anonymous data. But in practice, there are maybe very few or no technical barriers to making anonymous data not anonymous. Next slide. Let's skip over this because we don't have time. Let me see. Okay, I've used up 10 minutes. So now we get to the sort of the commercial implementation. This is just one example. My previous examples have been academic. Now we're looking at data mining as an actually implemented business model today. And after I explain that, we'll get into sort of how should it or could it be regulated. So this is one example, Google Now, and Professor Kokurio had the example of a digital butler. This is really the same thing, a digital personal assistant. It reads your email. It knows what's on your calendar. It knows what web pages you're looking at, what ads you've seen. If you have one of their cell phones, an Android cell phone, it knows where you are in real time. It knows where you live. Even if you don't have an Android cell phone, just from your IP address, it can resolve literally what your address is and with the Street View database. It knows what you're buying, generally speaking. It makes recommendations to you about what you should buy. It can guess that you might want a coffee if you're walking down the street, if you want an airline ticket. It knows if your airline flight is late. It will warn you. Basically, it's a digital personal assistant that knows everything about you, that follows you around every minute of your life, is standing behind you, looking over your shoulder at everything that you do, and making recommendations, and generally making itself very useful to you as well. It doesn't require room and board. You don't have to pay the salary, because interesting, and here's the interesting twist in the business model, it remunerates itself by taking a cut on the things that you buy based on its recommendations, based on the ads that it puts in front of you. And because it knows so much about you, the ads that it puts in front of you are highly relevant and actually quite likely to trigger a purchase. So this is, a very powerful and very innovative business model. Next slide. The question is, okay, so here's the main point. Obviously, how should we regulate these business models? I think my baseline point of view is that in a free market, commercial transactions between consenting adults should be free. Providing that, but nevertheless, a free market doesn't mean no regulation. We have the notion of the rule of law, of contracts, of fair and non-deceptive trade practices, so that both sides in the transaction know what they're agreeing to, know what they're getting. So there's a basic idea of regulation that, and this is really quite well reflected in the existing European Union Data Protection Law, the 1995 directive. You're allowed to do this, provided a firm can do this kind of commercial data mining and tracking and targeting if it tells the consumer what it's doing and if the consumer is able to freely consent. Now, what the Europeans mean by freely consenting is a bit more than rapidly clicking through terms of service that's many pages long that no one reads. The European Union, in its current investigation of the Google privacy policy, said, look, it's not good enough to have a long, detailed privacy policy. You've got to make sure that people actually understand what they're agreeing to. And furthermore, the agreement has to be expressed. It cannot be just implicit or by default. So basically, and we can talk about the EU. I think, let me just make a parenthesis quickly on the European Union, sort of the data protection law. I think that it's very interesting to be here today in Asia and to hear the speakers giving these very interesting presentations on Japanese and Korean and the bilateral and multilateral agreements around data protection. In the European Union, I would argue that the European Union today is de facto becoming the world's regulator of data protection. Because in the United States, we have very narrow data protection laws that are focused on vertical industries, such as HIPAA for healthcare and FERPA for education. We have banking regulations, and these are very narrow, very detailed laws. And as a prominent academic researcher, Professor Paul Schwartz, recently said in conference, in the US, we have these detailed data protection laws that people expect them to be enforced. In Europe, until now, they've had very broad, abstract umbrella laws, which I disagree with Professor Kokurio. I would say the notion of privacy in Europe really emerged after World War II and was a reaction to the events of that time and a desire to protect citizens from intrusive searches of their own homes, and that evolved throughout the 1950s and 60s into a notion of data protection, which is actually a bit different from privacy. But anyway, the Europeans have this framework. It's become very detailed, but it's very broad. It's much broader than the US regulations because it covers everything. And in practice, the Europeans are becoming the regulators for the rest of the world outside of the United States because no one else is doing it. Asia, maybe, and to use Professor Shrimpo's analogy, which I thought was very interesting, I mean, to some extent, and this is a simplification, but Asia until today has been maybe trapped in Galapagos regulations, although Professor Park's example showed that that's not quite true. Regulations that speak to individual countries, but don't address the rest of the world. So I think the EU basically has it about right in terms of regulating the type of data mining transaction that we're talking about. But let me go on to the next slide. We're doing a series of surveys around the world, and we're addressing the specific question of data protection, not for consumers who freely consent, but for data protection in institutions where you have sensitive, vulnerable populations, for example, schools. All over the world, you have schools are adopting cloud services, which are frequently free for schools. 5 minutes, okay, I'll get it done in less than that, I hope. This is something that the Europeans are just beginning to grapple with. No one really has a framework for this, neither in the United States, nor in Europe, nor in Asia, because it's so brand new. It's really only in the last year or two that cloud services have become so popular so quickly in schools. But what we feel is that a child in a school whose school contracts with a cloud company for a cloud service is not a consumer, not an individual consumer who can consent freely to a commercial transaction. And you see some of that in the European Union's investigation of the Google privacy policy, where they point out that if you are an employee of an organization and your organization contracts for a cloud service, that organization may not consent to a privacy policy on your behalf. You as an individual should not lose your rights to privacy or to data protection simply because your employer, or even worse, your school, has contracted with an outside provider. So with that, this is a work in progress. I think around the world, regulators are looking at, let's go to the next slide, if there is one. Yeah, okay. So there are not really tools in the regulatory and policy regimes around the world to deal with the data protection rights of these special sensitive populations. The EU data protection law does, however, have some tools that could be used, and I won't have time to discuss them, but codes of conduct, which is a recognized concept in the existing data protection law, model clauses, which is sort of the analogy to binding corporate rules for relationships between companies rather than within companies. Let me just say that this is a work in progress for the next 2 to 5 years to develop the regulations and the policies that will provide adequate protection in these special institutions, such as schools and government organizations that are using cloud. There are many other topics I'd like to discuss.